Okay, hello everyone. Those both of you in the room and those of you online. I'm James Wood. I'm associate professor at the University of East Anglia, and it's a pleasure and a real privilege to chair this session, which features two world experts in Thelwall studies. So our first speaker is Steve Poole, who is Emeritus Professor of History and Heritage at the University of the West of England, Bristol. He is the chair of the Thelwall Society, editor of the essay collection John Thelwall, Radical, Romantic and Acquitted Felon, published by Pickering and Chatto, and is the author of several other short works on aspects of Thelwall's life and career. As director of UWE's Regional History Centre from 2024, he has published widely on the social history of Southwest England, with a particular focus on criminality, the crowd, popular politics, and protest.
Thanks, James. Well, that's working. That's good. Okay, in Cecil Thelwall's Life of John Thelwall, the biography of John Thelwall, published by his wife shortly after his death, the words of an unidentified noble marquis are recorded, who suggests that the best thing to do with Thelwall is to buy him off, but failing that, to get rid of him in some other way. How many ways can there possibly be? Following the collapse of the government's treason trials in 1794 and the consequent reinvigoration of the Corresponding Society, Pitt's ministry and its extra-parliamentary allies became more determined than ever to obstruct, intimidate, and silence John Thelwall as Jacobinism's most effective mouthpiece. Legislation was framed to curb the right of public assembly, while Thelwall himself was followed and assaulted and his lectures broken up as he made his way around the country, as we've already heard. Now, these overt, very public obstructions are the subject of E.P. Thompson's well-known essay, Hunting the Jacobin Fox. But what I want to do with this paper is shine a light on some of the less noticed nuances in Thelwall's silencing and draw attention to some of the ideas lurking behind them. We've seen this portrait before. I'm sure we'll see it again, won't we, Judith? Okay, no, maybe not. Anyway, this is John Thelwall looking good. Why so much loyalist emphasis on Thelwall anyway, then? Of course, he had the highest public profile of anyone connected to the Corresponding Society. His powerfully energetic oratory saw to that. And for a while, he seemed inexhaustible, whether addressing thousands of Londoners outdoors at Copenhagen House and Marylebone Field in the autumn of 1795, or delivering animated lectures at Beaufort Buildings on the Strand, where twice a week, 500 to 700 people paid sixpence a head to spend just a couple of hours with him and hear him talk. Twice a week for most of that period, during the struggle against the gagging bills in November, Thelwall was there every night. Now, although he wasn't the Society's only effective orator, he was the only one widely recognizable. His very public presence and memorably sharp facial features, ensuring he was the only non-elite political figure to find his way into print shop caricature windows, alongside public men like Pitt and Sheridan and Fox and the King, actually, all instantly recognizable in caricature form to any Londoners passing a print shop. And so he became, in fact, a public man. And notwithstanding the theatrical bombast of his delivery, the Beaufort Buildings lectures, delivered completely independently of the London Corresponding Society, were a carefully managed exercise in civility and sociability, the opposite, if you like, in fact, of any Spencean free and easy or London Corresponding Society tavern meeting. These were designed to be different. This is both at buildings. This is where his lecture rooms were rented from. A stylish and respectable set of surroundings adjoining the Strand in central London. The sixpenny entry fee was designed to attract the respectable and educated middling sort, not so much the artisan class more often associated with the corresponding society, the curious as well as the politically committed, women as well as men. To encourage conversation beforehand, an hour was allowed for mingling and sociability between the hours of 7, when doors were opened, and 8, when Thelwall would appear on the rostrum. There's an hour there. Rumours abounded that men and women of quality had been seen at Thelwall's lectures, which were advertised in fairly conventional style like this. And perhaps it's in this context that we should note and take seriously government-inspired attempts to have Thelwall's rooms prosecuted as a disorderly house. That is, to force an association between Thelwall's lecturing and the low culture of the bawdy house. Now, a loyalist attempt to bring a disorderly house prosecution against Thelwall had already been made before the Court Leet of the Liberty of the Savoy, if you please, an archaic body with limited jurisdiction, but a right to try misdemeanours on that small area of London in which Thelwall's lecture rooms happened to be situated. And it just happened as well that the steward of the Savoy, who presided over the Savoy's court at that time, was none other than the arch-loyalist John Reeves, founder and leading light of the Association for the Protection of Liberty and Property against Republicans and Levellers. What a great name for an organisation. There he is. Reeves had tried to invoke the Disorderly Houses Act himself. That's the Disorderly Houses Act of 1752, quite an old piece of legislation. But he tried to invoke it, although it was, the Disorderly Houses Act was legislation originally intended to draw a legal distinction between a bawdy house in which prosecution rested emphatically on evidence of licentious sexual behaviour, and a disorderly house in which the meaning was technically, legalistically, more fluid. In practice, the term disorderly house continued to signify a place of sexual promiscuity above anything else. But the 1752 Act encompassed wider meanings of promiscuity in, quote, all places of entertainment, and particularly in the plebeian public sphere. So although only a misdemeanor rather than a felony, conviction for keeping a disorderly house could still bring fines of up to £100, an hour in the pillory, and possibly a spell in prison. So quite worthwhile putting one through if you could get away with it. The conflation of radical discourse with the idea of a disorderly house could render Thelwall's oratory a form of political promiscuity, if you like, mocked the polite facade of his lecture room and conjured disorder from what Reeves termed, I'm quoting Reeves here, 400 or 500 people tramping up and down Thelwall stairs of an evening. As Reeves put it, in fact, Thelwall's lectures were, quote, in reality, much more dangerous than all the tumbling houses of the metropolis. Bawdy houses. A local association with bawdy houses was actually there in any case, because the Strand had been a noted cruising ground for sex workers for decades. Reeves' gambit failed, actually. Well, he couldn't convince a jury. So we'll never know whether a conviction might have discouraged some of Thelwall's more respectable audience from attending further lectures. But in drafting new legislation in response to the crowd attack on the King's coach a year later, 1795, an outrage inspired in the government's estimation by Thelwall's oratory at Copenhagen Fields 3 days earlier, Pitt's ministry picked up where Reeves left off, reviving Reeves' theme, but spelling it out this time. Clause 14 of the Seditious Assemblies Act considered, quote, every house, room, field, or other place in which, quote, supposed public grievances were aired or debated without a license from magistrates became a disorderly house. While Thelwall, as we've heard, evaded the act by cloaking his lectures in classical allegory, prosecutions under it were actually pretty rare, as it turns out. Although, of course, in any case, the point of reviving the disorderly house as a linguistic trope was perhaps to tar reformers by association without risking possible failure at law. But let's consider an artful association of another kind. This one constructed Thelwall as a dangerous bridging point between parliamentary, respectable, and extra-parliamentary, less respectable, reformers. As I've already suggested, a degree of urbanity separated Thelwall's preferred public persona from that of the average member of a corresponding society. In 1792, Thelwall had been pleased to think of himself as, quote, I'm quoting Thelwall himself here, an organ of union between the middling class Society for Constitutional Information and the more radical London Corresponding Society. But as rumours grew of a more worrying approachement between the London Corresponding Society and the Foxite Whig opposition in Parliament in 1795, loyalist propagandists began turning what they saw as Thelwall's faux respectability back on itself, weaponizing it, if you will. Now, Isaac Cruikshank, had already placed Fox, Sheridan, and Stanhope in the Lilliputian crowd, lending their support to Thelwall's platform oratory in this print, The Royal Extinguisher, which shows Prime Minister William Pitt snuffing out radical meetings with the Seditious Assemblies Act. There they are. Thelwall, of course, in characteristic pose in the centre, surrounded by members of the loyal opposition, working together. And Gilray had made the Foxites leaders of the mob that attacked the King's Coach on October the 29th, 1795, in his print, The Republican Attack. Thelwall's not in this print. But as I said before, you know, the loyalist argument was that the attack on the King's Coach, the terrible outrage that it was, occurred partly as a result of Thelwall's oratory at Copenhagen House 3 days earlier. Government newspapers like the Oracle, the True Briton, and the Tomahawk had been linking Fox and Sheridan with Thelwall on an almost daily basis throughout 1795, as though Thelwall had always had a double existence. These rumours gathered pace after Fox and several of his parliamentary allies attended Thelwall's speech against the gagging bills at the last mass outdoor meeting of the Corresponding Society on the 7th of December, 1795. And shortly after that, Thelwall's Corresponding Society colleague, John Gale Jones, told a meeting at the Westminster Forum Debating Club that he had recently been waited upon by prominent Whigs with an invitation to bring the Corresponding Society into a general coalition against Pitt. Now, in fact, according to Thelwall's wife, quote, Thelwall was the means of this union which now took place between the Whig Club and the London Corresponding Society. For, she says, each had become, quote, necessary to the preservation of the other, although the London Corresponding Society officially denied having anything to do with the coalition with the Whigs. In May 1796, Thelwall returned to London from Norwich to give his backing to Fox at the Westminster election, where the second seat was being scrapped over by the Pittite Admiral Alan Gardiner and Thelwall's first political mentor, John Horne Tooke, who, though never a member of the Corresponding Society, had also been acquitted at the Old Bailey for high treason in 1794 alongside Thelwall. The election campaign saw Thelwall back on the stump in Beaufort Buildings, lecturing on the electoral franchise of ancient Rome and calling for cross-party radical unity to defeat the ministry. Fox was re-elected, Tooke wasn't, we lost, But Thelwall used Fox's election dinner to call once again for, quote, a union of all the friends of liberty. If they were united, he declared, they must be omnipotent. Now, in reality, there was no coalition at all. Fox had not even entered a formal electoral coalition with Tooke, but government propagandists nevertheless made what capital they could from Thelwall's endorsement of Fox. Here's a print by Thomas Rowlandson, warming to the theme. Thelwall's unwise associations, leaving him headless. The bottom right-hand corner. This is Admiral Gardner, the victorious Pittite candidate, cutting their heads and scraping them together. Not only Thelwall there either, not just Thelwall's head, but former secretary of the corresponding society, Thomas Hardy, too. Loyalist trumpetings about a supposed unholy alliance between the Whigs and the corresponding society came to a head in the summer of 1797, when Foxite frustration over Pitt's refusal to consider any measure of reform and Pitt's retreat into cabinet government led Fox to stage a controversial and symbolic walkout of his party from Parliament, which became known as the Foxite Whig secession. There he is, waving goodbye. Man of the people. Instantly recognizable, incidentally, right? That's it's not Dennis Healy, it's Charles James Fox. Well, so they say. Finally, then, so clearly Fox was now finally quite ready, at least rhetorically, to openly propose cooperation with the extra-parliamentary reform movement, who would otherwise be, he said, too weak to resist the court, or more ominously, prone to dangerous excesses. The two of them together would make things safer. Unsurprisingly, Fox's loyalist critics suspected darker motives because surely, as the Tory newspaper The Oracle put it, telling people that their parliament will not listen to reason was little short of an invitation to civil war. The suspicion that radicals like Thelwall, Hardy and Tooke were secretly plotting with disaffected parliamentarians like Fox, Stanhope, Sheridan and the Duke of Bedford to overthrow the state proved irresistible to satirists. Satirical print commentary on these developments reveals something of the sophistry of the loyalist attack on Thelwall. Earlier representations placed him firmly as the mob orator, unmannered, playing to and at home with a grotesque audience of plebeians, the sort of people we see depicted by Gilray in the famous Copenhagen House print. He's quite at home with all these rough customers, uneducated and unintelligent. Gilray in particular followed the loyalist line that the corresponding society was made up of bestial, politically disinterested, uneducated men with ape-like features. Here they come again. Another print from Gilray. A marginalization strategy distancing them from completely from respectable politics and civil society. In this sense, they were dangerous, but recognizable and socially and intellectually peripheral, and therefore perhaps not quite so dangerous. But Thelwall's shifting behaviours now prompted some re-scripting. In fact, as Cruikshank saw it, Thelwall was more dangerous without his lectern than with it. In this print, Thelwall is physically recognisable from his likeness. You can spot him, I'm sure. But otherwise unremarkable, as he consorts privately with a secessionist coalition that includes Erskine, Fox, Sheridan, Stanhope and Grey. He's no longer the orator, he's the secretive plotter, the midwife to Fox's monstrous offspring, Master Revolution and Miss Sedition. Should his profile be insufficient to identify him, I mean, he's here, by the way, and this is Tooke. Should his profile be insufficient to identify him, he addresses Horne Tooke, who breaks into the frame from the left with a query. Did you hear my last lecture? Tooke answers Thelwall with another question. Have you heard from Sheerness? He says. So in a sense, he becomes an intermediary between Fox and Tooke on the one hand, and between Jacobinism and the naval mutinies, which had just broken out in two places in 1797. on the other. Loyalist propaganda played much on the notion that Thelwall was somehow implicated in the mutinies, but could offer no evidence that he was. A mutineer named Wilson, so it was alleged in the press, had previously been a member of a corresponding society at Ipswich, where he gave lectures in imitation of Thelwall. And Thelwall, it was noted in several papers, had himself named the mutinous ships the Floating Republic, meaning thereby to put them in mind of assuming that name. 2 days later, Cruikshank hit the nail more firmly on the head, planting Thelwall below decks as confidant and grog server to the mutineers as they negotiate terms and conditions with Admiral Buckner. "Tell them we intend to be masters," says Thelwall. "I'll read them a lecture." Tuke is now under the table with the Foxite Whigs, but Thelwall stands independently beside his rudely drawn plebeian associates. Here was a man uniquely comfortable in both opposition and insurrectionary circles, and apparently able not only to move between them with ease, but to direct operations from an assumed position of influence. Later in the month, Cruikshank produced a third related image, the Watchman of the State. As in Diversions of Purley, the first one we looked at, Fox is the central figure, this time in the character of an absconding watchman, abdicating his responsibility to keep the more extreme wing of the suggested democratic coalition under some kind of control. Lauderdale and Bedford watch and applaud, while Tuke, Sheridan and Stanhope lay gunpowder trails to destroy the Constitution, the Commons and the Lords. A diminutive Thelwall with a paper marked Norwich Lectures in his pocket once again provides the link with extra parliamentary mischief making, this time lighting a taper from Stanhope's lantern in a bid to destroy aristocracy. In all three of these prints, Thelwall's physiognomy is reproduced with sufficient accuracy to make him recognizable. But there are no comic distortions of his features as you get in Gilray's prints. No allusion is made to his great oratorical voice or to his bodily energy or all the things we thought he was famous for. It's his ability to flit between personas that makes him the sinister customer in these prints. As the arch loyalist Robert Bissett put it, one prominent feature often mentioned in Jacobinism is its versatility. He is at one time a pamphleteer. We have him next as a novel monger. Next, the Jacobin tries his hand at playwriting. Now he changes himself into the form of a lecturer, and from his tub his nightly nonsense pours. He struts at the school desk, he pops upon us in the conventicle, he assails us on the roadside. A man of many faces, man of many parts. As in 1796, so in 1797, there probably never was any real danger of a workable alliance between the Foxite Whigs and the corresponding societies, whether brokered by Thelwall, Jones, or anybody else. Corresponding societies famously rejected hierarchical leadership. They were unlikely to have consented to being told what to do by Fox and Sheridan, or even Thelwall, come to that. For their part, the Foxites were quite probably keen to make use of the plebeian threat as a bargaining chip and to be seen as directors of a mob, but not so likely to meet corresponding society demands for universal manhood suffrage. But as far as Thelwall's marginalisation is concerned, the final straw probably came while he was at Derby in 1797. A critical moment, in fact, and one that remains largely overlooked, underexplored. Thelwall was, as we know, exhausted physically at this time, in ailing health, no longer wishing to make a living from public lectures. In fact, he wrote in the final issue of the Tribune, his own journal in which he published the text of his lectures. He said, "The press, formerly but an auxiliary, must now be my chief dependence, and my attention must necessarily be directed to publications more conducive to literary reputation and personal emolument." This meant by means other than, quoting him again, the regular application demanded by a periodical work. That meant the Tribune. So the Tribune was to be closed. And he also said it was time to break with what he called his confinement to the metropolis, hence the tours to East Anglia and beyond. And while he was in Derby in 1797, in his own words, he was, quote, applied to by the late principal proprietors of the Courier to undertake the management of that paper, a proposal which he readily accepted. Now, all we know about it, other than that, is that it didn't last very long. He accepted, but he didn't stay. Why? Because he was forced out of the job by some undisclosed pressure after only a fortnight. He never says what happened. And this is the point at which Thelwall declares in his own memoir, such was the conclusion of his political career. Now, these rather important events have been overlooked, partly because no evidence has emerged to take our inquiries any further, and it is a bit difficult, but partly because E.P. Thompson and those who followed oddly assumed that this Courier of which the people spoke was just some local paper of little consequence. But as we now know, there was no Derby Courier at this time. Nothing by that name, in fact, until 1828, and that one was an ultra-Tory paper, so it wasn't that. There's an elephant in the room. The London Courier and Evening Gazette, what the anti-Jacobin referred to as that dull and despicable medley of frenzy and malice. They should have had that as a masthead, shouldn't they? Not knowledge is power, but dull and despicable medley of frenzy and malice. Probably the most reform-minded nationally distributed paper in the country in 1797. I'll stick my neck out and say that. There were certainly some changes taking place at the Courier newspaper at this time, including an expansion into new print offices formerly owned by the Telegraph. And we do know it was trusted by the corresponding societies above all other papers. It was the only paper to carry the advert, I think you can see here, from the Nottingham Corresponding Society on its front page, where they were cheekily attempting to hold a meeting in contravention of the gagging acts. And another advert on another page advertising a simultaneous public meeting of the London Corresponding Society. The Courier was often read aloud at Corresponding Society meetings and used by the Society to post adverts for their activities. It carried Thelwall's own account of the attack made upon him in Stockport, written and posted shortly afterwards at Manchester, and it gave him room to write personally and at length about the riot in Norwich. It was to the Courier in January 1798, moreover, that Thelwall addressed his first public letter after arrival at Liswen, confirming his political retirement and putting the record straight about the riot at Ashby. There it is. Further letters from Thelwall to the Courier were intended to follow. He says at the end of that letter, I feel myself called upon to state the facts which, by your leave, I shall do through the medium of your paper as soon as leisure and circumstances will permit. Well, evidently, leisure and circumstances never did, and we hear no more about it, which is frustrating. So was Thelwall really briefly the editor of the Courier newspaper, even if only for 2 weeks? Rumours to that effect were certainly circulating, and in June 1797 they'd come to the notice of the Observer, which wrote, Thelwall has been stated to be the editor of an evening publication, more remarkable for its ability than its moderation, it added. But the paper then added that since any such report must surely be, quote, designed to injure that property, the report was surely untrue. So they said it wasn't true. What could conceivably have been done, and by whom, to force Thelwall and the paper's proprietors into such a speedy retreat after coaching it all the way to Derby to offer him the job? How might things have turned out differently for Thelwall had he remained in the job? It remains just one of those tricky nuances in the tale of Thelwall's running to ground, which he always insisted was achieved by mob violence and obstructive legislation above all else. He was forced into retirement, he told a Treason Trials commemorative gathering in 1824. He was forced into retirement, for no less than 7 times was his life assailed, and after that, Though his heart never failed him, it would have been madness to have further braved the enemy. Loyalist disdain for the courier can be seen even here, as a motley parade of reformers and Democrats add tracts to a demonic cauldron, to the accompaniment of a bugle blown by a courier postboy. Bottom right-hand side there, he has courier written on his hat, gleefully blowing his horn as these assembled radicals wander up towards the great radical Jacobin cauldron. Even as he takes his place in the queue, Thelwall himself is clearly defeated. "I'm off to Monmouthshire," he says, worn out, empty old windbag. The anti-Jacobins saw him off with pleasure. "Tied up, alas, is every tongue on which conviction nightly hung, and Thelwall looks, though yet but young, a spectre." We do need to see Thelwall's forced retirement as a more complex and nuanced process than it has sometimes been. Violent mob attacks and the constraints of the gagging acts were certainly the heaviest contributors, but character assassination is an art frequently pursued on many fronts. Thank you.